August 1945, when Japanese nurse Kimiko Yamada was captured and brought to an American POW camp, she expected torture and starvation. Instead, she was served ice cream, given medical care identical to American soldiers, and watched in disbelief as guards casually threw away more food than her family had seen in months. She had been taught that America was a weak, starving nation on the verge of collapse, yet everything she witnessed told a different story, one that would shatter not just her beliefs about the enemy, but everything she thought she knew about her own country's destiny. What did these Japanese women prisoners discover in American captivity that made them question whether Japan had ever stood a chance of winning the war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1942, life in Japan had changed in ways that seemed impossible just a few years before. The war that started as a great victory now touched every home, every meal, every moment of daily life. Rice, the food that had fed Japanese families for 1,000 years, became so rare that the government made strict rules about who could eat it and how much. White rice, once common on every table, turned into a luxury that only the very sick or very important could have. Most families ate a dark mixture of barley, millet, and sweet potato stems that left their stomachs full but never satisfied. In the cities, women stood in long lines that stretched around blocks, waiting for their monthly rations of soy sauce, salt, and cooking oil. The bottles they carried home held less each month. Sugar disappeared first, then butter, then fish. The government told everyone that luxury was the enemy, that every sacrifice brought victory closer. Posters on every wall showed strong soldiers defeating weak American troops. The messages were clear and loud. America was falling apart. Americans were soft and lazy. They cared only about money and comfort. Japan would win because Japanese people had strong spirits and pure hearts. Kimiko Yamada learned these lessons well. At 23 years old, she had trained as a nurse in Tokyo before the war started. She remembered the city when lights blazed at night, when shops sold silk kimonos and foreign chocolates, when her father rode the electric train to his office every morning. Now, in 1944, those memories felt like dreams from another life. The train still ran, but only sometimes, and only when there was coal to burn. At night, every window stayed dark because of blackout rules. Enemy planes might come at any moment. Kimiko volunteered to serve as a military nurse in the Philippine Islands. Her mother cried when she left, but her father stood proud. Serving the emperor was the highest honor. Kimiko believed this with her whole heart. She had attended the women's defense training, where they learned to fight with bamboo spears. If American soldiers invaded Japan, every woman would fight to the death. Surrender meant shame worse than dying. This was what every Japanese person knew to be true. On the island of Luzon, Kimiko worked in a military hospital that treated wounded soldiers. The building had been a school before the war. Now, blood stained the wooden floors, and the smell of infection filled every room. They ran out of bandages and had to wash and reuse old ones. Medicine was so scarce that doctors saved it only for soldiers who might survive. The dying received only water and kind words. The other nurses were women like Kimiko, young and trained to sacrifice everything. They worked 16 hours each day. They ate one meal of rice mixed with cassava root. Their uniforms, washed so many times the fabric grew thin, hung loose on their shrinking bodies. But they never complained. Complaining showed weak spirit. They sang patriotic songs while they worked, and told each other that victory was coming soon.
The American invasion of Luzon came faster than anyone expected. The sounds of artillery grew closer each day, a rolling thunder that shook the hospital windows. Officers gave orders to evacuate, but there was nowhere to go. The roads were cut off. The ships had left. On a hot morning in February 1945, American soldiers walked through the hospital door. Kimiko had been taught what would happen next. American soldiers were beasts who showed no mercy. They would torture prisoners and laugh at their pain. They would violate women and kill the weak. Death was certain, but she could choose to die with dignity. She stood straight and closed her eyes, waiting for the bayonet. Instead, a voice spoke in broken Japanese. "You are safe now. We are here to help." Kimiko opened her eyes. The American soldier was young, maybe 20 years old, with red hair and freckles across his sunburned nose. He held his rifle pointed at the floor. Behind him, other soldiers were moving through the ward, checking the wounded Japanese soldiers on the cots. One American medic was bandaging a Japanese soldier's leg. This made no sense. Enemies did not help each other. Enemies did not speak kindly. Kimiko looked at the other nurses, and she saw the same confusion in their faces. They had prepared themselves to die with honor, but no one had prepared them for this strange kindness. The Americans gathered all the nurses and the patients who could walk. They brought trucks, actual working trucks with fuel, something Kimiko had not seen in months. The Japanese army had no fuel left for vehicles. Soldiers walked everywhere, carrying supplies on their backs. But these Americans had trucks lined up like they had an endless supply. An American officer, speaking through a Japanese translator, told them they were now prisoners of war. They would be taken to a camp where they would be safe until the war ended. Kimiko felt her hands shaking. Being a prisoner meant permanent shame. Her family would never recover from this disgrace. But what choice did she have? The officer's voice was calm, almost bored, as if capturing enemy nurses was routine work, nothing special. They loaded the nurses onto trucks with canvas covers. Kimiko sat on a wooden bench, squeezed between two other nurses. No one spoke. The shame was too heavy for words. The truck bounced along rough roads for hours. Through gaps in the canvas, Kimiko saw destroyed buildings and burned fields. The war had torn through this island like a terrible storm. At the prisoner collection point, they waited in a tent while American soldiers processed paperwork. Kimiko watched everything with alert eyes. An American guard sat nearby, eating his lunch. He had a sandwich made with thick slices of white bread, the kind Kimiko had not seen since before the war. The bread looked soft and fresh. Inside the sandwich was meat and cheese and lettuce. The guard took 3 bites, then wrapped up the rest and tossed it into a garbage bin. Kimiko stared at that garbage bin. In Japan, people were starving. Her own mother wrote letters about eating grass and tree bark to fill her stomach. Children died from hunger in the streets, and this American soldier just threw away half a sandwich of real white bread like it meant nothing at all. Another nurse, a woman named Hana, who had worked beside Kimiko in the hospital, whispered so quietly that Kimiko almost missed it. "Did you see that? He wasted food." Her voice carried a mix of shock and anger and something else, something that might have been the first small crack in everything they believed. Kimiko nodded, but said nothing. Speaking about it would make it more real. The propaganda they had heard for years said Americans were starving, that their economy was collapsing, that they were desperate and weak. But if they were starving, why would a soldier throw away perfectly good food? If their economy was collapsing, where did all these trucks come from? Where did the fuel come from? Where did the fresh white bread come from? The questions grew in Kimiko's mind like seeds pushing up through soil, small and fragile but impossible to stop. She tried to push them away, thinking these thoughts felt like betrayal. The emperor and the generals knew the truth.
Simple nurses could not understand the bigger picture of war. She repeated these ideas to herself, but they felt weaker now, like a door that no longer closed completely. That night, they slept in a tent at the processing camp. American guards brought them blankets that were clean and whole, without holes or patches. They brought buckets of water for washing. They brought food, actual food, more than Kimiko had eaten in a single day for the past year. There was rice, white rice, a full bowl of it. There were vegetables cooked in oil. There was bread. There was even a small piece of chocolate.
Kimiko ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying not to cry. The other nurses did the same. They did not talk about what this meant. They could not talk about it yet. But every woman in that tent was thinking the same impossible thought. If the Americans could feed their prisoners this well, if they could waste food without care, if they had trucks and fuel and medicine and blankets to spare, then what else had been a lie? The ship that carried them to America took 3 weeks to cross the Pacific Ocean. Kimiko and the other nurses stayed below deck in a converted cargo hold. The room was crowded but clean. Each woman had a narrow bed with a real mattress, not just a mat on the floor. American sailors brought food 3 times every day, regular as clockwork. The meals were simple but always filling. There was bread at every meal. There was meat or fish. There were canned vegetables and fresh oranges. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kimiko tried to understand where all this food came from. Japan was an island nation that grew barely enough to feed its people even in peacetime. During the war, with so many farmers turned into soldiers, with so many ships sunk by submarines, food became more precious than gold. Yet America, also fighting a war across 2 oceans, seemed to have food to spare. The math did not work. Something was deeply wrong with what she had been taught. When the ship docked in California, Kimiko saw her first American city. San Francisco rose up from the harbor like a mountain of buildings, all of them whole and undamaged. Electric lights glowed in thousands of windows, even though the sun had not fully set. Cars moved through the streets in rivers of metal. The noise was overwhelming. Ship horns, car engines, train whistles, all blending into a sound of pure industry. This was a nation at war, yet the city showed no scars, no ruins, no signs of suffering. The prisoner of war camp sat 2 hours inland by train. Kimiko pressed her face to the train window and watched America roll past. Farms stretched to the horizon, huge beyond imagination. Machines that looked like metal insects moved through fields, doing the work of 100 people. She saw cattle in enormous herds, thousands of animals grazing on grass that grew thick and green. In Japan, a family might own 1 cow if they were lucky. Here, cattle covered the land like ants. The camp itself had been built recently. The barracks were new wood that still smelled of sawdust and paint. Each building had electric lights, not just 1 or 2 bulbs, but lights in every room. The bathrooms had hot water that came from taps whenever you turned them on. Hot water. Kimiko stood in the shower room and let the warm water run over her hands, watching it swirl down the drain. In Tokyo, her family heated water in pots over a charcoal fire, and everyone shared the same bathwater to save fuel. Here, endless hot water disappeared down the drain without anyone caring. The camp hospital was cleaner than any hospital Kimiko had seen in Japan, even before the war. White tile covered the floors and walls. The beds had white sheets that were washed every week. A young American nurse with blonde hair showed Kimiko around. She opened a supply closet, and Kimiko felt her breath catch. Shelves full of bandages, bottles of medicine, boxes of gauze and tape. Enough supplies to treat hundreds of patients.
In the Philippines, they had run out of bandages and begged for more. Here, the closet was so full that items sat unopened on the top shelves. The American nurse picked up a small bottle. "Penicillin," she said, speaking slowly so Kimiko could understand her English. "We use it for infections. Do you have penicillin in Japan?" Kimiko shook her head. She had heard of this miracle drug, but never seen it. Japanese soldiers died from infected wounds that this medicine could cure. The American nurse nodded and put the bottle back on the shelf, casual as if it were common soap. The food in the camp went beyond anything Kimiko thought possible. 3 meals every day, each one larger than what her family in Tokyo ate in 2 days. Breakfast was eggs and bacon and toast with butter. Real butter, yellow and rich, spreading smooth across warm bread. Lunch was sandwiches with thick slices of meat and cheese. Dinner was chicken or beef with potatoes and vegetables. And always there was milk to drink, cold and white and creamy.
On a hot afternoon in July, something happened that Kimiko would remember for the rest of her life. American guards brought carts to the recreation yard where the prisoners sat in the shade. The carts held metal containers that smoked with cold. The guards opened the containers and began handing out small paper cups. Inside each cup was ice cream, frozen and sweet, chocolate and vanilla swirled together. Most of the Japanese women had never tasted ice cream. Frozen desserts were luxuries that only the richest families knew before the war. Kimiko held the cold cup in her hands and felt tears burning in her eyes. This was not military rations. This was not bare survival. This was comfort, pleasure, excess. They were prisoners, and they were being served ice cream on a hot day. What kind of nation had resources to waste on making prisoners comfortable? Hana sat beside her, eating her ice cream slowly, making it last. "My brother is fighting somewhere," she whispered. "He is eating grass and insects to stay alive. I know this because my mother wrote to me before we were captured. And we sit here eating ice cream." Her voice broke. "How can we be winning this war? How can any of this be true?"
Other women heard and nodded, but said nothing. Speaking the thought out loud felt dangerous, like crossing a line they could never uncross. But the thought was there now, growing stronger each day. Kimiko was assigned to work in the camp kitchen. She expected to cook the way she had always cooked, with a knife and a cutting board and a pot over a fire. Instead, she walked into a room full of machines. A huge electric mixer stirred dough for bread without anyone touching it. An electric slicer cut vegetables in seconds. A massive refrigerator kept food cold, bigger than her bedroom in Tokyo. 5 women working in this kitchen prepared meals for 800 people, and they finished before lunchtime. In the corner of the kitchen, Kimiko saw wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. Each crate had red writing on the side. Coca-Cola. She had heard of this American drink, but never tried it. A truck came every week to deliver more crates, the driver cheerful and joking with the kitchen staff. Every week. More Coca-Cola than anyone could drink. More sugar water in bottles than Japan had sugar for medicine. That night, lying in her bed under clean sheets, listening to the electric fan hum in the corner, Kimiko felt something breaking inside her. Everything she believed about America being weak and poor had been a lie. Everything she believed about Japan being strong and rich had been a lie. The war was not close to being won. It had never been close. Japan had picked a fight with a giant that could bury them in food and medicine and ice cream and not even notice the cost. The turning point came on a cold November day in 1944. The camp commander announced that all prisoners would receive a special meal to celebrate an American holiday called Thanksgiving. Kimiko did not understand what this holiday meant, but she knew it must be important because the kitchen staff worked for 2 full days preparing food. On Thursday morning,
The prisoners gathered in the dining hall. The room smelled like roasting meat and baking bread, warm and rich smells that made Kimiko's mouth water. Long tables were covered with white cloths. At each seat was a real plate, not a tin tray, and real silverware. American guards stood along the walls, not watching the prisoners with hard eyes, but smiling and talking quietly among themselves.
The food came out on large platters carried by kitchen workers. Kimiko stared as each dish was placed on the table. A whole roasted turkey, golden brown and glistening with fat. Mashed potatoes topped with melting butter. Green beans cooked with small pieces of bacon. Sweet potatoes covered in a sticky glaze. Bread rolls so soft they pulled apart like clouds. Cranberry sauce the color of rubies. And for dessert, pumpkin pie with whipped cream. This was more food than Kimiko had seen in one place since before the war started. This was food for a feast, for a celebration, for a special occasion in a rich household. But they were prisoners. They were the enemy. Why would their captors feed them like honored guests? The camp commander stood and spoke. A translator repeated his words in Japanese. He explained that Thanksgiving was a day when Americans gave thanks for their blessings, for the harvest, for family and friends. He said that even in wartime, even with loved ones far from home, Americans believed in giving thanks for what they had. He said he hoped all the prisoners would enjoy the meal.
With herbs she could not name. She had not tasted meat like this in 3 years. Around her, the other women ate in silence, their faces showing a mix of pleasure and confusion and something like pain. The food was delicious. The food was abundant. The food was given freely to people who had fought against America. None of it made sense with what they had been taught about their cruel and barbaric enemy. After the meal, an American guard came to Kimiko's table. He was an older man, maybe 40, with gray in his hair. He spoke no Japanese, but he smiled and gestured to the empty plates. He said something in English that sounded kind. Then he pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered them around the table. The women hesitated. Then, each took one. The guard lit the cigarettes with his lighter, then sat down at the table and lit one for himself. He smoked with the enemy prisoners like they were friends, sharing a quiet moment. Kimiko watched him through the cigarette smoke. His uniform was clean and well-made. His boots were good leather with no holes. His face was relaxed, not tense with hunger or fear. This was a man whose country was taking care of him, feeding him, clothing him, giving him everything he needed. And that country had enough left over to feed its prisoners a feast on a holiday. That night, Kimiko lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her stomach was full for the first time in years. Her body was warm under the wool blanket. The barracks had heat that came through vents in the floor, invisible warmth that kept winter away. Everything about this place spoke of abundance, of systems that worked, of a nation so rich it could fight a war on 2 sides of the world and still have plenty for everyone. She thought about her brother, somewhere in the Pacific, eating handfuls of rice if he was lucky, maybe already dead from starvation or disease. She thought about her mother in Tokyo, standing in ration lines, burning furniture for warmth because there was no coal. She thought about the propaganda posters that showed American soldiers as weak and soft, about the radio broadcasts that promised victory was near, about the teachers who said Japanese spirit would overcome American machines. They had lied. Not just bent the truth or exaggerated. They had lied completely and totally, and thousands of men were dying for those lies. Millions of people were starving for those lies. The whole nation was burning itself to ashes for lies told by leaders who either did not know the truth or did not care.
The next week, a group of American women came to the camp. They were volunteers from a nearby town, members of something called the Red Cross. They brought packages for the prisoners. Each package contained soap, a toothbrush, writing paper, pencils, and chocolate. The Red Cross women smiled and spoke through translators, asking if the prisoners needed anything else, if they were comfortable, if anyone was sick. Kimiko accepted her package and felt her hands shaking. These were civilian women, American mothers and wives and daughters. They had come to help the enemy, to bring gifts to people whose country was killing American boys. One woman had a gold star pin on her dress. The translator explained that this meant her son had died in the war, died fighting Japan. And still she stood here, handing out packages to Japanese prisoners, her face kind and sad, but not angry. This broke something deep in Kimiko's heart. She had been taught that Americans had no honor, no loyalty, no human feeling. But this woman, who had lost her son to Japanese bullets, showed more grace and mercy than Kimiko had ever seen from her own commanders. When Japanese soldiers died, their families were told to be proud and never cry. Sadness was weakness. But this American mother wore her sadness openly and still found room in her heart for kindness to strangers. The Red Cross women started English classes for prisoners who wanted to learn English. Kimiko joined because she had nothing else to do, and because speaking English might help her survive. The teacher was a young woman named Margaret, who wore practical dresses and flat shoes. She taught them simple words and phrases, always patient, always encouraging. One day, Margaret brought magazines to class. They were called Life and Look, thick publications full of photographs printed in color. Kimiko turned the glossy pages and saw America as Americans saw it. Photographs of families sitting in living rooms with sofas and lamps and radios. Photographs of cars parked in driveways of houses with green lawns. Photographs of supermarkets with shelves stacked floor to ceiling with food in cans and boxes and bottles. Photographs of children playing in parks, fat and healthy and smiling. There were also photographs of women working in factories, building airplanes and ships, women wearing pants and work boots, operating heavy machines, welding metal, doing jobs that in Japan only men could do. Margaret explained that American women had jobs, that they could own property, that they could vote for their leaders. She said this like it was normal and obvious. Kimiko felt dizzy with the strangeness of it. In Japan, women belonged to their fathers and then their husbands. Women did not vote. Women did not own land. A woman's duty was to obey and serve and sacrifice. But these American women in the photographs looked strong and confident, like they believed they mattered as much as men. Margaret showed them a film one afternoon. It was an educational film about American democracy, about how the government worked, about how citizens could speak freely and question their leaders without being arrested. The film showed people voting, showed courts where judges were independent, showed newspapers printing different opinions about the same events. It showed a system where power did not flow from one man at the top, but spread out among many people who checked and balanced each other. Kimiko watched the film and felt her entire understanding of the world shifting like sand under her feet. The emperor was divine. The emperor's will was absolute. Questioning the emperor was the worst crime possible. But Americans questioned their president all the time. Newspapers criticized him. Citizens argued about his decisions. And somehow, instead of falling into chaos, America had become the strongest nation on earth. After the film, Hana whispered to Kimiko in Japanese, "Do you think it is real?
Could people really live like that? Her voice carried desperate hope, like a person dying of thirst asking if water exists. Kimiko looked around the room at the other prisoners. She saw the same question in every face. For months they had been living in this camp, seeing American abundance every day, being treated with basic human dignity, watching their captors throw away more than most Japanese families owned. The evidence was overwhelming. America was not weak. America was not cruel. America was not on the edge of collapse. That meant Japan had been wrong about everything. Wrong about the enemy, wrong about the war, wrong about what made nations strong. Japanese leaders had said that spiritual strength mattered more than material wealth, that discipline and sacrifice would overcome machines and technology. But Kimiko now understood that machines and technology came from something deeper. They came from education, from freedom to think and question, from systems that let people work together without fear. She thought about the word the American commander had used at Thanksgiving: blessings. He had said Americans gave thanks for their blessings. In Japan, they gave thanks to the emperor for allowing them to serve him. They gave thanks for the honor of suffering. They gave thanks for the chance to die gloriously. But they never stopped to ask if maybe they should not have to die at all. Maybe a nation that took care of its people, that fed them and educated them and let them speak freely, was stronger than a nation that demanded they starve in silence.
Kimiko started keeping a diary, writing her thoughts in Japanese on the paper from her Red Cross package. One night she wrote words that would have gotten her arrested in Japan. We were told Americans were demons, but they treat us like humans. We were told America was dying, but America has more life than we ever had. We were told to die for the emperor, but no one here has asked us to die. They only ask us to live peacefully until the war ends. Who were the demons? Who was really dying? What did we die for? She hid the diary under her mattress, but the questions lived in her mind now, too big and too true to ignore. The propaganda had been poisonous, and she had drunk it eagerly. Now she was awake, and the awakening hurt worse than any wound. The war ended in August 1945 with a flash of light brighter than the sun. Kimiko heard about the atomic bombs from the American guards, who spoke in quiet voices about cities turning to ash in seconds. Then the emperor spoke on the radio, his voice thin and distant, saying words that no one ever expected to hear. Japan would surrender. The divine nation had lost.
The prisoners in the camp gathered in small groups, some crying, some silent, all of them lost in a storm of feelings too complicated to name. Kimiko felt relief that the dying would stop, shame that her country had been defeated, and something else she could barely admit even to herself. A small, guilty sense of gratitude that she had spent the war in this camp instead of starving in Japan or dying in the ruins of some Pacific island. The repatriation process took months. There was paperwork to fill out, health checks to pass, ships to arrange. In December 1945, Kimiko and 300 other Japanese prisoners boarded a transport ship in San Francisco Harbor. The American military gave each prisoner a bag of supplies for the journey home. Inside were canned food, chocolate bars, soap, and a wool blanket. Kimiko packed these items carefully in the small suitcase the Red Cross had given her. She also packed her diary, her English textbooks, and a photograph that Margaret had given her, showing an American family standing in front of their house. The ship's hold was crowded and uncomfortable, nothing like the prisoner of war camp. But the food was still regular and sufficient, and no one threatened them or treated them roughly. After 2 weeks at sea, the ship entered Tokyo Bay. Kimiko stood on deck with the other women, watching Japan appear through the morning mist. She expected to feel joy at seeing her homeland again, but instead she felt a heavy dread settling in her stomach like a stone. The closer they came to shore, the more she could see what the war had done. The harbor was full of sunken ships, their rusted hulls sticking up from the water like the bones of giant animals. The docks were damaged, with huge sections broken and collapsed. Buildings along the waterfront were hollow shells with no roofs, their windows empty and black. Smoke still rose from some areas, though the war had been over for 4 months. The smell of burning and rot drifted across the water. When the ship docked, Japanese officials came aboard to process the returning prisoners. The officials were thin men in worn uniforms, their faces hard and tired. They spoke sharply, asking questions about why the prisoners had surrendered, why they had not chosen death instead. The shame was immediate and crushing. In America, Kimiko had almost forgotten what shame felt like. Now it wrapped around her like heavy chains.
The train from the port to Tokyo took 3 hours. Kimiko pressed her face to the dirty window and watched the destroyed countryside pass by. Every city was flattened. Every factory was burned. Fields lay empty because there was no one left to farm them. The few people she saw on the roads were thin as skeletons, dressed in rags, moving slowly like ghosts. Tokyo was worse than anything Kimiko had imagined. The firebombing had turned whole neighborhoods into deserts of ash and twisted metal. Miles and miles of nothing but rubble and burned wood. A few buildings still stood here and there, lonely and damaged, surrounded by emptiness. People lived in shacks made from scraps of metal and cardboard. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes sat on street corners, too weak to beg. Kimiko walked through streets she had known since childhood, but nothing was familiar. Her family's neighborhood was gone, completely erased. She asked an old woman sitting by the road if she knew what happened to the Yamada family. The old woman pointed to a refugee camp set up in what used to be a park.
The camp was a collection of tents and lean-tos where hundreds of families crowded together. Kimiko found her mother living in a space barely big enough to lie down, sharing it with 2 other families. Her mother was 50 years old but looked 70, her hair white, her body bent and fragile. When she saw Kimiko, she started crying, but the tears seemed more from exhaustion than joy. Kimiko's father had died in the firebombing, her mother said. Her brother had died in the Philippines, though no one knew exactly when or how. Her sister had married and moved away before the war. It was just the 2 of them now. That first night, Kimiko opened her suitcase and took out the canned food from America. Her mother stared at the cans like they were treasures from heaven. They opened a can of peaches, and Kimiko watched her mother eat the sweet fruit with tears running down her face. 1 can of peaches, something Americans threw away without thinking. Here it was a miracle. Kimiko gave her mother the wool blanket, soap, and chocolate. She kept only her diary and her photograph. Her mother held the blanket and asked where these things came from. Kimiko said they were gifts from the Americans. Her mother's face twisted with confusion. The Americans gave you gifts, but they were the enemy. Kimiko did not know how to explain. How could she describe the abundance, the kindness, the gentle treatment? How could she make her mother understand that the enemy had fed her better than her own country ever had? The words would sound like madness or betrayal. Over the following weeks, Kimiko learned to stay quiet about her time in America. When other people asked about her experience as a prisoner, she said only that she had survived. She did not mention the ice cream or the Thanksgiving feast or the hot showers. She did not talk about the Red Cross women or Margaret's English classes or the magazines full of photographs showing American wealth. People in Japan were eating grass and bugs to survive. They did not want to hear about prisoner of war camps with heating and electricity and 3 meals a day. But staying quiet was its own kind of torture. Kimiko carried the truth inside her like a secret that grew heavier each day. She had seen what a strong nation looked like. She had seen what happened when people were free to think and question and build. She had seen that sacrifice and suffering were not strengths, but signs of failure. When the American occupation forces arrived in Tokyo, many Japanese people viewed them with fear and hatred. But Kimiko felt something different. She saw the American soldiers handing out food to starving children. She saw them bringing medicine to hospitals. She saw them starting to rebuild roads and bridges. She watched them work alongside Japanese civilians, treating them as equals, not as conquered slaves.
Kimiko found work as a translator for the occupation government. Her English was not perfect, but it was better than most. The job paid in American dollars, which could buy food on the black market. She used her salary to rent a small room for herself and her mother, to buy rice and vegetables, to slowly build back some kind of normal life. Other former prisoners of war found similar work. They formed a quiet community, people who had seen the same things, who carried the same secret knowledge. They met sometimes for tea and spoke carefully about what they had learned. Most of them agreed they could never fully explain it to people who had not been there. The gap between wartime Japan and America was too wide, too deep. You had to see it to believe it. Years passed. Japan began to rebuild, and the rebuilding followed patterns that Kimiko recognized from her time in the camp. American advisors pushed for democracy, for women's rights, for education, for free markets. The Japanese constitution was rewritten to include voting rights for women. Schools started teaching students to question and think, not just to memorize and obey. Factories were rebuilt with American machinery and American methods. Kimiko married a man who had been a prisoner of war in the United States, a former soldier who had worked on a farm in Kansas. They understood each other without having to explain. They both knew that Japan had lost the war long before the first battle was fought, that the outcome had been decided by schools and factories and freedoms that existed decades before the war began. They had a daughter in 1952. Kimiko taught her English from the textbook Margaret had given her. She told her daughter that education was the most important thing, that asking questions was not disrespectful, but necessary, that a good nation took care of its people instead of asking them to die. The daughter grew up in the new Japan, a Japan that became rich and peaceful, a Japan that learned to build instead of destroy. Sometimes Kimiko took out the photograph of the American family standing in front of their house. She showed it to her daughter and said, "This is what I fought against. This family, with their house and their car and their children, we were told they were weak and evil, but they were just people trying to live good lives, and our leaders decided to destroy them because we could not stand seeing them have what we did not have." In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, Kimiko wrote a final entry in the diary she had started in the prisoner of war camp. Her hands were old now, the writing shaky, but the words were clear. "I spent 2 years as a prisoner in America, and those 2 years taught me more truth than all my years of freedom in Japan. I learned that a nation's strength does not come from forcing its people to suffer and die. It comes from educating them, feeding them, letting them speak and think and build. I learned that our enemy was not cruel or evil. They were simply free in ways we had never been. I learned that everything we were told about the war was a lie designed to hide our own weakness. The cruelest part is not that we lost. The cruelest part is that we fought at all, that millions died for leaders who sent them to fight an enemy they never understood, a war they could never win. In my captivity, I was given better food, better shelter, better kindness than my own country ever provided. That is the truth that broke my heart and opened my eyes. We did not lose the war on the battlefield. We lost it in our schools and our farms and our government offices, in every place where freedom and questions were crushed under the weight of blind obedience.
The Americans defeated us not because they were more cruel, but because they were more free. That is the lesson Japan had to learn. That is the lesson the world should never forget. Kimiko lived to see her daughter graduate from university, to see her granddaughter born, to see Japan become one of the richest nations on earth. She died in 1989, in a hospital with clean sheets and modern medicine, in a country that had learned its lesson about what really makes a nation strong. On her bedside table sat the photograph of the American family, faded now, but still clear, a reminder of the truth she had discovered as a prisoner of war, the truth that set her free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.